Why every superpower has a secret history of regime change. A hidden secret no one have told you about. What if I told you that every single nation that has ever called itself a superpower, every empire, every hegemon, every so-called force for global stability, has, at some point in history, secretly reached into another country, grabbed its government by the throat, and replaced it with something more convenient? Not once, not twice, dozens of times. And what if I told you that this is not a conspiracy theory? It is documented history, recorded in declassified files, congressional hearings, and presidential memoirs. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the most consistent, least discussed patterns in modern geopolitics. We're going to follow the money, follow the power, and follow the trail of governments that were quietly toppled while the world was looking the other way. This is the secret history of regime change, and it belongs to every superpower that has ever existed. Before we go any further, let us define what we mean by regime change, because this term gets thrown around a lot and it deserves precision. Regime change is the deliberate effort by an outside power to remove an existing government and replace it with a different one. It can happen through military invasion, as the world saw in Iraq in 2003. It can happen through covert CIA-style operations, funding opposition groups, staging coups, or backing rebel factions. It can happen through economic pressure so severe that a government collapses from within. And it can happen through propaganda, reshaping public opinion until the population itself rises up and removes its own leadership. The methods vary. The motive is almost always the same. Control. Control over trade routes, control over natural resources, control over ideology, control over geography, control over allegiances in a world where alliances mean survival. Superpowers do not intervene in foreign governments because they are generous. They intervene because they are strategic. And once you understand that, the entire history of the modern world starts to look very, very different. Let us begin with the British Empire, the largest empire in human history, and arguably the original masters of regime change. At its peak, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land surface. But raw military force alone could not hold an empire that vast. What Britain perfected was something more subtle: the art of installing compliant rulers and removing uncooperative ones. Look at Egypt in 1882. Britain had significant financial interests in the Suez Canal, the economic lifeline between Europe and Asia. When an Egyptian nationalist movement under Colonel Ahmad Urabi threatened to nationalize those interests and assert Egyptian sovereignty, Britain did not negotiate. It invaded. It defeated the Egyptian army at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, occupied Cairo, and effectively reduced Egypt to a protectorate, run by a Khedive who answered to London. Look at Persia in the early 20th century. When Iranian political movements threatened British control over Persian oil, controlled through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP, Britain intervened in Iranian politics repeatedly, propping up pliable rulers and undermining those who pushed back. Look at India, where the British East India Company spent over 2 centuries systematically replacing local rulers, Nawabs, Maharajas, regional kings, with British-controlled administrators, using a combination of military force, legal manipulation, and strategic betrayal. The British Empire wrote the playbook. Every superpower that came after them read it. Now let us turn to the Soviet Union, the ideological counterweight to Western power for most of the 20th century. The Soviet approach to regime change was distinctive. Where Britain often acted for commerce, the Soviet Union acted, or claimed to act, for ideology. The spread of communism was the stated mission. But beneath the ideology, the logic was identical. Install governments that serve Moscow's interests, remove those that threaten them. In Eastern Europe after World War II, the Soviet Union executed one of the most systematic campaigns of regime installation in modern history. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany, Moscow used a combination of military occupation, political manipulation, and outright intimidation to replace pluralist governments with single-party communist states loyal to the Kremlin. When those installed governments showed signs of independence, when they dared to reform, Moscow acted swiftly and brutally.
In Hungary, in 1956, when Prime Minister Imre Nagy announced Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and appealed to the United Nations, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest within days. Nagy was removed, arrested, secretly tried, and executed. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, when Alexander Dubček introduced reforms during what became known as the Prague Spring, attempting to create what he called socialism with a human face, the Warsaw Pact invaded. 500,000 troops from 5 countries poured across the border. Dubček was flown to Moscow, pressured to sign away his reforms, and later expelled from the Communist Party. The Soviets even developed a doctrine to justify this pattern. It was called the Brezhnev Doctrine, and it stated explicitly that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in any socialist country where socialism itself was under threat. In other words, Moscow reserved the right to topple any government in its orbit that stepped out of line. The ideology was different. The mechanism was the same. And now we arrive at the nation that has conducted more documented cases of foreign regime change than any other power in the modern era: the United States of America. This is not an anti-American statement. It is a historical one, and the evidence is overwhelming, much of it declassified by the American government itself. Let us walk through just a fraction of the record. Iran, 1953. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was a democratically elected leader who made one fateful decision. He nationalized Iran's oil industry, ending the British-American stranglehold on Iranian petroleum. The CIA and British intelligence, in an operation codenamed Ajax, orchestrated a coup. They paid Iranian newspapers to run anti-Mossadegh propaganda, funded street protests, bribed military officers, and engineered his removal. The Shah of Iran was reinstalled as an authoritarian monarch. He ruled for 26 years. His repression eventually produced the Iranian Revolution of 1979, a revolution whose consequences the world is still living with today. Guatemala, 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz implemented land reform, redistributing unused land held by the United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation with deep ties to the Eisenhower administration. The CIA ran Operation PBSUCCESS, a covert campaign of psychological warfare, paramilitary operations, and political destabilization. Arbenz was overthrown. Guatemala descended into a civil war that lasted 36 years and killed an estimated 200,000 people. Chile, 1973. Salvador Allende was the first democratically elected Marxist leader in South American history. Nixon famously told the CIA director to make Chile's economy scream. The CIA funded opposition groups, supported media campaigns, and backed the military officers who, on September 11, 1973, bombed the presidential palace and seized power. Allende died in the palace. General Augusto Pinochet ruled Chile as a dictator for 17 years, during which thousands were tortured, disappeared, or killed. Congo, Indonesia, Greece, Brazil, Nicaragua, Panama, Afghanistan, Iraq. The list extends across decades and continents. A study by political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke found that the United States attempted to change the governments of other nations at least 72 times during the Cold War alone. 36 of those operations covert. The justification was almost always the same: stopping the spread of communism, protecting American interests, preserving freedom. Whether the target government was actually communist or simply inconvenient rarely seemed to matter. So why do superpowers keep doing this? Why is regime change such a persistent feature of great power behavior across ideologies, across centuries, across cultures? The answer comes down to three interlocking realities. First, the security dilemma. Superpowers exist in a world of competition. When a rival power gains influence over a neighboring country, that is not just a diplomatic inconvenience, it can be an existential threat. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, the United States came to the brink of nuclear war to remove them. From Washington's perspective, a communist government in Cuba allied with Moscow was an intolerable security threat. From Moscow's perspective, American missiles in Turkey and Western Europe justified a counter-move. Each side's defensive logic looked like aggression to the other. Second, economic interest. Superpowers are built on flows of capital, resources, and trade. When a foreign government threatens those flows by nationalizing industries, closing ports, shifting alliances, or joining competing economic blocs, the superpower's entire economic architecture is at risk. The British did not go to war over Egypt because of abstract imperial pride.
They went because of the Suez Canal. America did not overthrow Arbenz because of ideology. It overthrew him because of bananas and the political influence of the United Fruit Company. Third, the credibility imperative. A superpower that allows a client state to defy it without consequences signals weakness to every other country in its orbit. The Brezhnev Doctrine was not just about Hungary or Czechoslovakia. It was a message to Poland, Romania, East Germany, and every other satellite state. Do not try this. American interventions in Latin America served the same purpose. They were demonstrations of resolve, messages that the Monroe Doctrine was not theoretical. Regime change, in other words, is not a bug in the superpower system. It is a feature. It is what superpowers do to maintain the architecture of dominance that makes them superpowers in the first place. You might be thinking, that was all Cold War history. Surely the world is different now. It is not. The tactics have evolved. The logic has not. Russia's intervention in Ukraine, its support for separatist movements, its alleged operations in Georgia, Moldova, and the Baltic states, these follow the same pattern. A major power attempting to control the political direction of its neighbors.
China's growing influence operations across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, funding infrastructure projects that create economic dependency, supporting politicians aligned with Beijing. This is regime influence, if not yet regime change, executed at a global scale. And the United States? The post-Cold War decades brought Iraq in 2003, a full military invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein based on intelligence that proved false, igniting a regional catastrophe. Libya in 2011, NATO intervention that removed Muammar Gaddafi and left behind a failed state torn by civil war. The attempted destabilization of Syria. Debate continues over what role external powers played in the Arab Spring and its aftermath. The tools have become more sophisticated. Social media manipulation, cyber operations, economic sanctions designed not to change behavior but to destabilize governments. The underlying architecture of power remains. Every generation believes it has moved beyond the brutality of previous eras. Every generation is partially right and mostly wrong. So what do we do with all of this? What does it mean for how we understand the world? It means we should be deeply skeptical of official justifications for foreign intervention. When a superpower announces that it is intervening somewhere to restore democracy, to protect human rights, to stop a humanitarian crisis, those stated reasons may be real, but they are rarely the whole story. Behind the rhetoric is almost always a calculation of strategic interest. It means we should understand that the governments of smaller nations are not always the autonomous expressions of their people's will. They are, in many cases, products of external pressure, foreign funding, and great power maneuvering. When we see an authoritarian government in a strategically valuable country, we should ask not just what that government is doing to its people, but who put it there, and who benefits from its continued existence. It means we should have humility about the long-term consequences of intervention. Almost every major case of regime change has produced outcomes that the intervening power did not intend and did not want. Iran's revolution, Guatemala's civil war, Iraq's sectarian collapse, Libya's failed state. The logic of intervention is always confident in the short term and almost always disastrous in the long term. And it means that the citizens of superpowers, people like you, bear a particular responsibility. Because these operations are often conducted in your name, with your tax dollars, by your governments. Understanding them is not just intellectually interesting, it is a civic obligation. The secret history of regime change is not a story about evil nations and innocent ones. It is a story about power, what it requires, what it does to those who wield it, and what it costs those who stand in its way. Every superpower in history has looked at the map and seen not just countries, but pieces on a board. Every superpower has, at some point, decided that a particular piece needed to be moved, quietly, forcefully, or both. The question is not whether this will happen again. History answers that question clearly. The question is whether we, the citizens, the voters, the witnesses of history, will demand something better. Whether we will insist that power be exercised with accountability, with transparency, and with genuine regard for the lives it reshapes.
That is not naive idealism. That is the only thing that has ever made superpowers behave differently. If you found this video educational, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The truth about power is only dangerous when it stays hidden. I will see you in the next one.